Hello everybody and welcome back into Austin's election predictions. So on this video I'm going to look at both Texas and Florida in the same video. I'll try to get through both pretty quickly. And let's start with the state of Florida with Real Clear Politics. And this almost shows two completely separate results. The Harris X poll and the Trafalgar Group are showing a small lead for Rick Scott. On the other hand, the other polls are showing a relatively sizable lead for Bill Nelson. So it's either a 2-point lead for Scott or a 4 to 7 point lead for Nelson. Let's take a look at some of the older polls. And some of the older polls from St. Pete's had a lead for Rick Scott. It was a 1-point lead here. They had another 1-point lead for Scott, but more recently, the 4-point lead for Bill Nelson. This is a very large poll too, 3,088 respondents. That's a lot of respondents. That's generally good news for Nelson. Now taking a look at the Harris X poll, they've had a larger lead for Scott in the past. Again, a 3-point lead here. It's down to 2 points. But generally, we haven't seen these 4 to 7 point leads except for a few here back in mid-October. They've been generally 1, 2, 3 point leads for each candidate. And if you go back even further, there was a time when Scott had a sizable lead over Nelson, but things seem to have switched. So, is it possible Scott wins based on these polls? Absolutely. But I'm either thinking it's going to be a close Scott win or a big Nelson win. All right, let's move over to 538, take a look at a couple of more polls, and take a look at Nate Silver's averages here. St. Pete's, again, that's the idea. It's a 3.7 point lead. Harris gives a 4-point lead to Rick Scott. This is on the 3-day average. Again, the last one had a whole week average. The more recent polls from Harris show a 4-point lead for Rick Scott. Here's Quinnipiac, 7-point lead. Emerson College, a 5-point lead. So again, you have a lot of polls that are showing relatively sizable leads for Bill Nelson, and again, Nelson's the one who will be favored in this as a result. Go over to the light model. This is what Nate Silver predicts, a 5 and 7 chance for Bill Nelson to win, just 2 and 7 for Rick Scott. Going into the classic model, 7 and 10 for Bill Nelson. The deluxe model, 5 and 7 as well. So a 70-75% chance according to Nate Silver. I think that's pretty close to accurate. I'll get into my final prediction in a couple of moments. Let's move over to the spending in this state, and this is interesting because we haven't heard all that much about the spending. We've heard about spending from Beto O'Rourke. We've heard about it from all these other folks. We've not heard about it in the Florida Senate race, and it is a pretty big deal because Rick Scott has outraised Bill Nelson about 2.5 to 1, which is very, very good news for Rick Scott. He has spent almost all of that money, though. $66 million spent to $25 million for Bill Nelson, cash on hand in the final days favoring Bill Nelson over Rick Scott. What does that mean going forward? It's not totally clear. What we have seen, though, is Rick Scott has spent a lot of money on this Senate race. All right, moving into our final aspect of the Florida race, we will take a look at early voting. So early voting, I'm going to simplify this down over to my Word document the way I did in previous videos. And what does it show you? It shows that the GOP is trailing the Democrats by 0.4 points in the 2018 early voting. Now, this is based, to be specific, on the voted by mail early and voted early. I've not included the ones that have not yet been returned because, well, they haven't yet been returned, and we don't know if they will be returned or not, despite the fact that the ballot was provided, and it happens quite frequently. They'll be sent, and maybe they won't have a chance to put it in time. They won't have a chance to mail the ballot in properly. There are a whole host of reasons as to why things could go differently with the ones that have not yet been returned, especially since this is being updated as of, I believe, today, and they still haven't been in. That's not very promising, so I've not included those. Anyways, it probably is a little higher than 0.4 because the Democrats have about 120,000, 110,000 more vote-by-mail ballots that haven't been returned than the Republicans do. So a 0.4 lead for the Democrats, maybe it's closer to a 0.8 lead for the Democrats in the early voting. With that said, 2016, Hillary Clinton had a 1.3% lead over President Trump in the early voting. Yet Trump won the state by 1.2 points. So the fact the Democrats leading in the early voting by 1 point does not point to a blowout win for the Democrats in my mind. I think it actually more closely mirrors that of the Harris X poll and that of the Trafalgar Group poll. With that said, the majority of polls are stating that Bill Nelson will win this race. If I had a bet on it, I'm saying this race is tilting in the Democratic column. Not heavily, but somewhat. So that I would still guess, if I had to, that Bill Nelson wins this Senate race. I'm not sure if it will be to the 4 to 7 point variety, but I think it's enough so that he ends up winning. He is the incumbent while Rick Scott is the governor and his approval rating has been up in the air, somewhat mediocre. There's polls on both sides of the fence. There's no doubt about that, but I do think Nelson holds a small lead. Okay, that will do it for us in Florida. Let's check out the state of Texas with the Real Clear Politics polls over there. There's some closer polls, especially that from Emerson and that from Quinnipiac. With that said, the CBS and Trafalgar polls show a much larger lead for Ted Cruz. We haven't really seen anything aside from this one poll from Emerson and an earlier poll from Vox and one from, I believe it was, not sure exactly what the outlet was, but I think it was Ipsos that showed a lead for Beto O'Rourke. It's the only poll ever that has showed a lead for O'Rourke. With that said, the leads are pretty healthy right now for Cruz in RCP. We move over to the Texas race for 538, and it's showing a small lead for Ted Cruz. Again, whether it's 8.9 points, again, Democratic pollster Change Research, that gives Cruz a 1.5 point lead. Emerson College has him up by a few. Quinnipiac, University of Texas. Generally, there is not a single poll really that does not show Cruz on top. The only two that showed otherwise are ones from back in September, the Ipsos poll and the Vox poll that I was mentioning earlier. Okay, now you have an idea of what the polls look like. They're generally favorable to Ted Cruz. There's no doubt about that. There really aren't many polls that show O'Rourke ahead. The Vox poll showed it pretty close. The Ipsos poll showed it pretty close, but those are all statistical ties. A lot of these polls are not statistical ties, whether it's the Trafalgar Group poll, that is definitely not a statistical tie, and the Ipsos poll here, that probably is, but some of the other ones, like this Dixie strategy, that's probably not a statistical tie, because again, the margin of error about 5 points. You double it because it's plus or minus 5 for both candidates. That's how you get an idea. But generally, these polls are favoring Ted Cruz. There is one other thing I'd like to look at, and that comes down to the two other things. I'm going to look at the open secrets, and this is interesting. We're seeing a ton of money pour in for Beto O'Rourke. I mean, it is coming through, flooding through the state of Texas. Ted Cruz is getting some himself, but O'Rourke is defeating him by a large margin in that cash raised. Nearly $70 million for Beto O'Rourke, and he still has more money in the final days of the election moving into this home stretch. It's election day today, though, and let's take a look at the final early polls. We do not have numbers for Ted Cruz versus Beto O'Rourke. We don't know the specific percentages as to who's voted for which party. What we do know, though, is what the age gap is. And this is good news for O'Rourke, possibly even very, very good news for O'Rourke. In some other states, whether it's Florida, they have 1.7%. Arizona has 1.9%. This is the 18 to 21-year-old group. This is 3.2% for the state of Texas. That's a very good number for Beto O'Rourke because the young people generally vote very, very high numbers in favor of the Democrats. 22 to 29-year-olds, it's a similar phenomenon, 7.1%. Some other groups, whether it's Florida, they're at 4%. Arizona, they're at 4.5%. Again, a high number for Texas with people who are under 30 who are voting. It says right here, over 10% of early voters in Texas are under 30 years old. Extremely promising for Beto O'Rourke. Now sort of in the middle age bracket, again, higher numbers for the 30 to 39 age group, 11.3%, and the 40 to 49 is 14%. These are all significantly higher numbers than the rest of the population. So where is it coming from then? It's the 50 to 64-year-old group, which is lower than most of every other group. And the group that has the fewest voters compared to other states, that would be the 65-plus group. So this is very, very good news for Beto O'Rourke because O'Rourke is getting that youth vote out. We talked about how he may have, this idea of getting the voters out, really energizing people and energizing a group that had not previously been energized. Well, that's happening. According to the early voting, we are seeing signs that the younger people are out and they are voting in a big way. That is very, very good news for Beto O'Rourke. That'll just about do it for me here. My final prediction, I'm going to say that Texas will go to Ted Cruz, but it will be a close race. We've been talking about it for a long time. In the past, I thought Ted Cruz would win by 8 to 10 points. Not all that close. Early voting is showing otherwise. We have seen problems with early voting in the past, but these numbers look very, very good for Beto O'Rourke. As a result, I'm saying it's a close race, maybe only a 2 to 3 point race. Ultimately, Ted Cruz comes out on top. So that'll do it for me today. I'll be back later this afternoon with a video on the House, a video on the Senate, and a governor's map video right before the election. You can check them out back on Austin's election predictions. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and stay tuned until next time.